Right, it's 2021. It's 7:01 on Tuesday evening. We're back with the Dan and Omar show. Happy New Year, Dan.
Happy New Year, pal. 2021.
Yeah, well, let's hope, as I'm sure everyone said already, let's hope it's a better one. It's not started off on the footing, but the only way is up. I don't know what better way to start the year, I suppose, with a transfer window and a bit of Sky Sports News yellow ticker tape to get us all excited and forget about the fact that we're all stuck indoors.
I was a bit disappointed you didn't put your yellow tie on, to be fair.
Yeah, no, that'll come. Have we got? Does it coincide with deadline day? No, sadly not. It looks like it'll be a Monday this year.
Well, maybe we can do a bit of live. Maybe we can do a live streaming in the last few hours.
I'm not sure how many people are going to have watching and listening to that, to be fair.
You got to give people what they want, Omar.
Talking football strategy on deadline day. I'm not sure that's doesn't really work. Doesn't really fit in, does it? But yeah, we thought we'd kick off the new year with the transfer window, most obvious place to start. But firstly, when we were chatting before the show, I think it'd be useful to kind of go a level up. Dan, why do we even have transfer windows? If I wanted to change jobs, Blake, if you're watching, I don't. But if I did, I'd be able to do it whenever I wanted. But footballers are stuck within small periods throughout the year. So why is that the case?
Well, yeah, I write about it in the book as well, and I almost think we take it sort of for granted sometimes that we've got these particular restrictive periods where effectively contracts can be terminated and registrations can be transferred. And I think everybody sort of accepts the status quo for what it is now, and unless there's some type of pretty systemic event, things might not change anytime soon. But I think for those that think the window works fine because there are these particular times that transfers can happen, I think the types of rationale that people would consider is that sort of sport is special. It's not like any other business. Late transfers in the season could change sporting strength of a team over the sporting strength of one team over the other, and could distort the functioning of the league. Things like clubs shouldn't be able to just, with a few games left by a particular player, like from another team where there's nothing to qualify, say if they're willing and wanting to try and win the league, avoid relegation, qualify for Champions League or Europa League. And I think probably from a contractual stability perspective, if you were able to transfer a player throughout the year, I presume it would probably make it possible and easier for other clubs to unsettle players. That longer term instability might lead to greater turnover of players, less connection between the fans and the players that they're supporting, and I guess reduced continuity throughout the season. So I think on one hand, we talked about it, you've got the balance of season and competition integrity balanced against some that would argue that the window doesn't work, needs to be abolished, simply because it does fundamentally restrict the ability of the player labour market. It's not possible to transfer a player from one club to the other outside of those defined windows.
Yeah, sport is weird, isn't it? Because in many contracts, although I think there's some debate about the legality of this, in many kind of standard employment contracts, you can't move to a direct competitor. Whereas in football, you obviously can quite readily, and there's nothing restricting players doing that. Can you imagine if players kind of had to take 6 months out of the game before they could move to another club? So, yeah, I mean, out of interest, we'll probably get into a kind of whole transfer system debate another time, but there's been no real challenges as to the transfer window system. Everyone's kind of happy as is.
Well, just very briefly on that point, and we'll go on to that, which was players are one thing, managers are another. So yeah. We talked about gardening leave, restrictions on a manager being able to potentially move. And again, query, we have the system in place for players. We don't have the system in place for managers. So whilst it can be more and less restrictive, I think it's more a possibility that a manager could be put on gardening leave, could be restricted from going to a competitor unless both parties agreed a set fee, of compensation fee that would make it acceptable for all parties. But onto your point as well, yeah, the truth is to the best of my knowledge, there's never been a challenge to the football transfer system that has gone full way to a national court or the European courts or the European Commission or otherwise. There have been cases in basketball, I believe, but ultimately that was deemed that transfer windows were permitted and were to be potentially compatible with EU law. Query whether we don't need to concern ourselves with those type of EU law questions anymore. But and I think the last thing is that, and maybe this comes to maybe something then we can talk about from your side in terms of planning that goes in from a club perspective. I guess that if players are able to necessarily move any time in the season, does it potentially make clubs make more rational, more logical, less pressurized, fewer pressure signings as a result? So I know we can talk about that counterfactual, but maybe more generally, in your experience, and obviously you're working with a lot of different clubs throughout the world, generally speaking, how do clubs go along around planning for the January window, and does that differ from the summer window?
Yeah, you almost dread to think if the current situation is perceived to be more rational than what might happen in a kind of counterfactual situation. You dread to think what that counterfactual is. One of the things, I'll get to the point on planning, but one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about sporting integrity, let's say you remove transfer windows today, but you still had that danger of player, I don't know, let's say Man United were competing, or Arsenal were coming close to getting into the top four, or Wolves were getting close to the top four. Mm. They could just sign Wilfried Zaha at the end of the season and get him in and probably give them a boost to qualify for the Champions League. Mm. I wonder if you could introduce some kind of rule where any rival club could sign Zaha, gets first option to sign Zaha instead. As a kind of crazy idea. That's the kind of chicanery, I guess, you'd have to come up with in order to prevent those kind of issues. I know they used to stop it, didn't they, in March?
I remember, yeah. So it was open till then, and I guess that was because you get to the business end of the season and you want to avoid those type of anomalies actually occurring.
Yeah, but March is pretty late. I mean, you got Champions League quarterfinals in March. You got probably game week 30-ish, if not later in the season. So it's pretty late. But yeah, on the planning point, certainly having those boxes of time. And I know a lot of execs at football clubs appreciate that time. It's very hard to get hold of an exec at a football club in September, I found, because they will sign off August 31st and come back a couple of weeks later. Once the window's closed. So just from pure kind of life balance point of view, I suppose it's a good thing. But yeah, just in general, I think having these discrete windows enables you to gear up to something and then turn your focus somewhere else during the other months of the year. And it also just gives recruitment departments ability to create processes and just have a bit more structure around things. It's just a bit more of a kind of stability around it. I suppose one of the big challenges this year is that clubs have been, well, firstly, there's the two windows that are much closer together. So I think the last window closed in October, and then the new one opens up 2 months later. Then you've also got the effect of the fact that we're not so far into the season. So we haven't even hit the halfway mark, I think, in the season yet, whereas normally you'd do that late December, maybe first week of January. So you've got, and by the end of a January window, normally you might be 22 games in. This time you might only be kind of 18, 19 games in. So even those 4 extra games give you a bit more information about what you might need towards the end of the season. Whereas now you're kind of planning for a longer stretch of time, more uncertainty with that. It becomes harder to plan, obviously. So yeah, there's a few things this year, and then obviously with English clubs only learning the Brexit or post-Brexit work permit regulations, which we discussed before Christmas, only learning that kind of towards the end of November, and having to then either strike off a lot of names or go, oh, suddenly we've got this pool of players over here who are available. And it's for that reason, I think we'll probably see quite a reduced level of activity this window. One of probably the most noticeable thing about the summer window was the reduced level of activity in terms of volume of deals. So Premier League clubs still spent a lot of money, but they really struggled to sell players. And so they probably don't have much spare cash to invest in their squad for this window. So I think a lot of clubs are going to be looking to sell players. Selling players is really hard because a lot of clubs don't have money at the moment. So yeah, really kind of awkward scenario. I actually think deadline day is probably going to be, we've spoken about some damp squibs before in recent years. I think this year's going to be really, really boring.
Well, I find it interesting as well is that, I know Liverpool aren't the exception to the rule, far from it. But, the way that, for example, they are playing down their spending capabilities and capacity generally seems to be maybe a slightly newer market trend generally of even the big clubs, because of the, big revenue falls, commercial, match day, food and beverage and everything else that comes with that, the match day experience generally, as well as some rebates as well, I guess, that almost the narrative to a degree now seems to be, spending isn't the be all and end all, really. We've got big squads. Sometimes, Liverpool might need particular for position, but, teams like Manchester United seem to have, a whole squad of number 10s is probably the truth. And for maybe a lot of clubs, it might be that balancing act between getting requisite transfer fees and or good possible loan deals and trying to get players off the books who are probably earning significant amounts but just simply not playing. And that circulation of players, obviously, if it reduces, everything else reduces as a result.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like an exponential effect as opposed to kind of a linear effect. I think it's interesting with Liverpool. Everyone thinks they need a centre back, but the noises that are coming through the press is that they're not willing to spend, and that may well be the case. But it's also a very good negotiating position, right? Because a club thinks, particularly at the moment with clubs so cash strapped, it's the quickest way to earn a buck at the moment in football is to sell a player for a lot of money to probably a Premier League team. And if a potential buyer is saying, actually, we're not that interested in buying him, and you think, perhaps I need to shift my player for a reduced price. And so Liverpool have done that really well in terms of getting players probably cheaper than what they're worth to the team. So I think there's an element of that. And also, speaking of kind of negotiations and the panic of January and the premiums and so on, I've actually heard of cases where clubs have told managers or even written into contracts that they can't or shouldn't speak about the transfer window basically during their press conferences, and they can't apply any pressure on the club to go and recruit players because again that just destroys your negotiating position. If you're the sporting director at Wolfsburg and you've got a really good player that Club X in the Premier League is interested in, and the head coach comes out and says, "Yeah, we're looking for a few new signings to bolster the squad," as Sam Allardyce actually came out for West Brom and said that, then you're going to hike up your price. So yeah, there's January is kind of because of that kind of what's the word? Just all the emotions kind of come together at once in January, and that's some of the challenges that you have. What is it like for agents in January? Is it particularly different? And obviously you work a lot with them. Is it particularly different for you at all?
I think if maybe taking out of this one as the outlier is the truth, and just looking back on previous Januaries, I think what you said is really interesting about, the January window is pressurized for a number of particular reasons. I think, as we were talking about before preparing this, overachieving teams are actually thinking about whether it's worthwhile investing to be able to go on higher, Europa League, Champions League or above, or, depth into particular cup competitions. Underachieving teams are conversely thinking, well, rather inversely thinking exactly the same, which is we need to get back to our medium position and make sure that we're not going to suffer relegation, that we're not going to be in the midst of particular problematic situations. So what that always then feeds into is, how much more of the season do we have? How are we going to model how many points we think we're going to get? To your points of actually not being further through the season than traditionally we would have been, I think definitely factors stuff in more. Whether that will now be because actually what teams might be looking for in the short term is possibly more robust players that can play more back-to-back minutes because there are more games to play by the end of the season must come into particular clubs' thinking. But I think then for the agents, it's just a constant evolving feast. And I don't mean feast in a positive way sometimes. I mean that, what I talk about sometimes, what we've talked about is sort of multiple games of chess being played at the same time. One move leads to another move, leads to another move. Maybe it's chess and dominoes, and then one reaction leads to a flow of in a particular way, and then links happening, and then one agent connecting this to that because that situation has occurred, etc. So, my feeling of January is it always feels a little bit more panicked, depending on the relationships that my clients will sometimes have with the clubs that they're mainly dealing with. And that can be the potential issue. So barring injury and other things, I agree that the sense and feeling I have is that it will be a relatively quiet window unless there's a club that has done pretty well, weathered the storm. For example, just like Chelsea did in the summer window, where they had cash to spend and had made profits because of a couple of previous anomalies, Hazard and transfer window ban and those type of things. I don't think there are those type of outliers for this January window to the same degree. And even though you might see an out of context big deal from somewhere, it feels less likely. So again, maybe I'll put this back to you. There's always value in January. And it'd just be interesting to sort of hear your views on, that way up between our clubs holding fire until the summer. Is there actual value to be garnered from January transfers, and can it really lift a team in different ways?
Yeah, so I think the types of players that clubs try and target in January are generally those that aren't playing as much, because it's very hard to try and prize away a top player at that time. Actually, one thing we do see a fair bit in January is a player being signed and then immediately being loaned back, because the selling club doesn't want to derail their season by selling a key player. In general, though, what we found is that so we compare the prices paid for players versus what our statistical models assess as a kind of a fair value for a player in kind of an objective market. The average premium is around 39% on a player in January, which just goes to compare that to summer where there'd be no premium. Which goes to show how much more it's a seller's market really. There's high demand and not a lot of supply. So that's something that clubs need to kind of weigh up, because is that 40% premium actually going to be return on itself, not just in the following season, but also not just in the current season, but also in following seasons, because the amount of mistakes I suppose you can make and you'd be stuck with. We've spoken about this before. You're stuck with for 4 or 5 years. With very few exit markets at the moment, it's a real challenge to do that. One other thing we've found is that if you're looking to spend money, how much do you need to spend in order to improve your league position? Because if you just go out and buy a bench player, clearly that's not going to have a huge impact on the squad. So if you look at the correlation between points per game post window versus points per game pre-window, and how much that's correlated with actual spend, what you find is that for a team to gain roughly 1 or 2 points over the remainder of the campaign over what they would have otherwise expected, they need to spend around 30 million euros. And that's an average team. Some teams will have to spend more in order to achieve that points gain. Teams that spend smart won't have to spend as much. So, the clubs certainly don't have 30 million euros just knocking about at the moment. So again, it's just highlighting the fact that it's really difficult to find value in January. And I do think I've been working now with clubs and recruitment for it's nearly 9 years now, and year to year you don't notice the change as much, but if I think back over that period of time, the attitude towards the January window, I think it was the January window 2011, wasn't it, where we had the Carroll, Suarez, Torres deals. And that's pretty much when I started working in sport, all the way through to now. It's just a world away. I just don't think we'd see those kind of deals happening, certainly with the same kind of frenzy that seems to take place at that elite level of the game. And I think that's a function of clubs realizing that it's pretty rare that you'll find a really good deal in January.
And then that sort of leads on to the next point. You probably touched on it and probably spent a bit of time on talking about just then, but do you have any measure of how then successful, how you measure the success of particular deals, and how best that then that gets factored into the pie?
Yeah, so different ways of looking at this. I think one of the most obvious ways is looking at minutes played, and in general, what you see is that players who are bought at any time in the season will generally, an average player will play around 50% of minutes during a campaign, and that doesn't really vary too much by January signings or summer signings. But that's kind of bizarre. If you spend, if you have your record signing and they're only playing 50% of minutes, you'd think you get a better return on that, but that tends to be the case. And I'm sure anyone listening to this can think of their club's record signing and think about how likely it was that player was a success. In roughly half the cases, they probably weren't. So there's that as your kind of baseline. But one thing we see a lot in January is that there's more strikers bought than other positions, which kind of makes sense, because if you're, again, we're talking about clubs who are struggling, probably underachieving a bit more likely to spend. If you're underachieving, you've probably got issues at both ends of the pitch. Most easy one to resolve through the transfer market is goal scoring. Defensively, you can work on the training ground. You can, get a coach like Sam Allardyce in to kind of fix things defensively. But going forward, very few coaches are going to be able to snap their fingers and fix an attack. So you need to go out and spend. But I've got some stats here because he looked up for me, or looked us up for us last year. They're amazing stats. So strikers are roughly 20% of deals in January. When you think about, they roughly constitute, let's say 11%, depending on what formation you play, 11%, 9 to kind of, what would it be? 9 to 18% of players. So the disproportionate spending on strikers.
Yep.
Only 1 in 7 score 5 or more goals in post-January. So, if you're looking to get a striker in half a season, 10 goals a season striker over the course of a campaign. So, that'd be kind of a mediocre striker. Getting 5 goals, only 1 in 7 deliver that. And 55% of strikers don't score at all after being signed in January. So, and if you think about, again, you're not just signing these players for half a season, you're signing them potentially for a year. So if you've signed someone that hasn't scored in those 6 months, then you probably got real concerns about what might come next.
I think it's like anything. You see the 35-yard screamer. You see the Suarez out of the January deals, and or you see the Torres and Andy Carroll equivalents. You only ever see the extremes and the very memorable things that therefore happen as a result, and that sort of unconscious or conscious bias based on their memorable event or the memorable transfer, then I think skews a lot of people's idea about the success or otherwise then of what can be done. But in terms of then success rate, and I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot because you might not have the detail. How does the January success rate compare to the summer success rate?
Yeah, it's not hugely different. Obviously, there's some stats there on strikers which are better for those signed in summer, but in terms of playing time, it's broadly similar in terms of roughly the average signing playing around 50% of minutes. You do see defensive players tending to get more minutes if they're signed in January compared to attacking players. So again, just a sense that if you bring in a defensive stalwart, they're probably going to make their mark pretty quickly. And again, if you think about the circumstances in which clubs might sign players in January. So again, take West Brom, Sam Allardyce, you might end up having clubs or managers target players that they already know. And for defensive players, much easier to defend their position in the team compared to an attacking player who, if they aren't scoring goals, within a couple of games, then you kind of have to drop them, or you need to reposition them in the team. So that's, I suppose, the context by which you end up with some of those numbers.
Very cool. We've got a couple of questions coming in. We've got Olivier's asked one, which maybe we can both have a think about, which is, do you think clubs with a stable financial situation can take advantage of the current situation to bargain transfer prices, as some clubs really need cash in hand?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on that with Chelsea in the summer. So one of the things we found when we looked at the numbers for the summer window was that the prices of elite players tended to hold up a bit more. So if you're talking about players who are kind of £25 million plus, you tended to sign them for the price that they would have been pre-COVID. But what happened was that the value of players, under £10 million just collapsed. In some cases, a lot of those players didn't move at all, even though they probably would have done pre-COVID. So I think with smart clubs, clearly you can target the clubs that highly reliant on match day revenue and haven't had any coming in. Or if you look at Liga at the moment and the broadcasting situation they've got there, hugely up in the air as to what kind of funds Liga and clubs will have, what kind of position they'll be in financially, by the end of the season. So a lot of them might be looking to the Premier League and be very grateful that Liga is kind of a higher banded league in the Premier League's new in the FA's new governing body endorsement regulations. But that's those are kind of some of the opportunities that might exist. But again, I think buying clubs themselves, even the Premier League, are going to be reluctant. With the lack of fans in, we're going to be hitting a new broadcast cycle soon, or going out to market soon, which would be really interesting to see what direction that goes in. So huge amount of uncertainty at the moment, and I think it's probably only a small group of clubs, those at the top end of the Deloitte Money League, who are going to be thinking about spending money.
And the other thing, just very briefly, I know we touched on it a while back with using sort of Liverpool spending in the summer about taking advantage of transfer prices. There was reports in The Athletic that when Liverpool was signing Thiago and Jota, Thiago for around 25 and Jota for over 40, that actually the effective down payments, or those initial instalments, were possibly under 12 to 15 million pounds. So that you had a total transfer liability of approaching 65 million pounds potentially, but those initial instalments, for whatever reason and however they were negotiated, actually only committed Liverpool to, from a cash flow perspective, a reduced down payment structure. Perhaps they may have to spend more money in bringing the player in by enlarging the overall transfer fee. But I think one of the things that's sometimes very important to consider, one is from a transfer installment perspective, is how much cash is the club actually going to get in there and then as the selling club. And I think secondly, the important thing is then, how does that impact them from an accounting perspective, i.e. that amortization of those transfer fees or the profit over that particular amount of time. So I think sometimes taking advantage of the transfer position of clubs that are in reduced or worsening positions is certainly something. But again, there are so many nuances in terms of how to negotiate what upfront payments are due, and how that works in practice becomes a really important part to think about.
Yeah, and one of the things we've seen is this proliferation of lenders in football, and football-specific lenders as well, not just kind of big banks that are lending to football clubs, but specific businesses that are set up to kind of advance cash to either buyers or sellers. So from a selling club point of view, if you're, I think it might even been reported that this was the case, but when Palace sold Wan-Bissaka, normally, as you said, they wouldn't receive the 50 million upfront from Man United, but they can get an advance of the cash from a lender, obviously at a rate. So I know that the reason there's been a proliferation is because of COVID. Over the summer, I know we certainly spoke to a few of these just kind of out of interest to see what was happening in the marketplace. There's a number of lenders now who just fundamentally they aren't lending to support great value deals or anything like that. They're just they're interested in the solvency of the clubs that they're lending to. But yeah, generally it's that's another dynamic, and again, it's a case of how much risk clubs want to take on when they're engaging these types of lenders.
I think we're at 5:30.
Nice one. Well, new year, new window. We've probably primed everyone that's going to be a bit dry and boring, but hopefully there'll be some kind of wacky deal that will kind of undermine everything we've just said.
I think there will be lots of interesting stuff that goes on. If it's reports and deals breaking down, etc., then maybe we can get on. And some news is that we're hoping to try and get a couple of guests on for the next few shows, just in case you've had enough of us already, but just to provide a bit of insight, industry insight from a slightly different viewpoint. So it might well be next week we have a nice little announcement to make.
Yeah, nice one. All right, cheers, Dan. I'll catch you next week.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.